My husband mocked me, calling me useless as a wife, in front of his friends. He thought I'd break, thought I'd beg for approval. Instead, I showed him exactly how useless I could be, when I stopped caring, stopped trying, stopped being his safety net. And when he fell, no one was there to catch him. The sound of laughter crashed over me like a tidal wave, drowning out the very air in my lungs. My hands, still damp from washing the last dish, trembled as I gripped the kitchen counter. The voices coming from the dining room were familiar. Jason's friends, the men he admired, the ones whose opinions mattered more to him than mine ever had. And then his voice rose above them all. "She's pretty much useless, honestly," Jason said, his words sharp and effortless like they meant nothing. "I mean, she's nice to have around, but let's be real, she doesn't actually do anything." A chorus of laughter followed. The blood in my veins turned to ice. My fingers curled into my palm, nails pressing into my skin. I stood frozen behind the kitchen doorway, unseen but fully exposed, as though I had been stripped of all dignity in a single breath. Useless. The word rang in my ears, bouncing off the walls, sinking into every corner of my being. I swallowed hard, stepping back as Jason continued, oblivious to my presence. "I mean, I let her play house, you know? It keeps her occupied. But honestly, if she left tomorrow, nothing would really change." More laughter. And just like that, something inside me broke. Not in the way he expected. I didn't cry. I didn't storm in and demand an apology. I didn't plead for his respect. Instead, I smiled. Not because I found it funny, but because, in that moment, I understood something I had been blind to for far too long. Jason thought he was untouchable. He believed I was so devoted, so dependent, that I would always be there, cooking his meals, washing his clothes, running his life while he played the role of the charming, successful husband. But he had just made a critical mistake. He had shown me exactly how little I meant to him. And that meant I was free. I turned away, my mind already racing. I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't argue. He expected that. He was used to me fighting for his approval. But tonight something was different. I wasn't hurt. I was done. And Jason? He had no idea that by the time he realized what he had lost, it would be far too late. I walked upstairs with deliberate steps, the sound of Jason's laughter still ringing in my ears. Each footstep felt heavier, like I was shedding an invisible weight with every step. The woman who had walked into this house as a devoted, eager-to-please wife was gone. The one climbing these stairs was someone entirely different. Someone who had finally opened her eyes. I entered the bedroom, the familiar space that once felt like a sanctuary now resembling a cage. The neatly made bed, the framed wedding photo on the dresser, the soft glow of the bedside lamp. All of it felt foreign. My fingers hovered over the picture for a moment before I turned it face down. Jason's words played in my head on an endless loop, but instead of hurting, they fueled something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. He had spent years chipping away at my confidence, making me question my worth. Tonight he had simply said out loud what he had always believed. That was his mistake. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. A moment later, the bedroom door swung open. Jason strolled in, loose tie draped around his neck, smelling of expensive whiskey and arrogance. He stretched his arms, yawning as if he had just returned from an exhausting battle rather than an evening of belittling his wife. "That went well, don't you think?" he said casually, kicking off his shoes. I didn't answer. I simply walked into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. For the first time in years, I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked. The reflection staring back wasn't weak, nor was it broken. It was someone on the edge of transformation. A plan began to form. Not an act of revenge. Not a desperate attempt to win back his respect. No, this was something far more powerful. I would disappear, not physically but in every way that had made his life effortless. I had been his safety net, his silent fixer, the one who cleaned up the messes he didn't even notice. That ended now. The next morning I woke up before him. That wasn't unusual. I was always the first to rise, preparing breakfast, ironing his shirt, making sure everything ran like a well-oiled machine. But today was different. I stayed in bed. The alarm blared. Jason stirred, reaching blindly to snooze it before groggily sitting up. His gaze flickered toward me in confusion. "You feeling sick or something?" he asked, rubbing his face. I stared at the ceiling. No. He frowned but didn't push further. When he left the room, expecting the scent of coffee and warm toast waiting downstairs, I remained where I was, unmoved. From the bed, I heard the rustling of cabinets, the frustrated sighs as he searched for something to eat. A spoon clattered into the sink. A cabinet slammed. My lips curled. Minutes later he reappeared, adjusting his tie. "You didn't make breakfast?" I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze with an expression so neutral it was unsettling. "Didn't feel like it." His brows knitted together, but he shook his head as if dismissing a minor inconvenience. "All right. I'll grab something on the way." For Jason, this was a small glitch in an otherwise predictable system. What he didn't realize was that it was the beginning of a complete collapse. The first few days passed with little reaction. He assumed I was in a mood, that this was some silent protest I would abandon once I got tired of proving a point. He carried on, adjusting where necessary. But as the days stretched, the small cracks in his carefully curated world widened. His morning coffee was no longer perfectly brewed and waiting. His shirts were wrinkled. Appointments he had never kept track of began slipping past him. Bills I had always handled went unpaid. The house, once an extension of my care, started reflecting my absence in ways he wasn't prepared for. The laundry piled up. Dishes remained in the sink longer than usual. Calls went unanswered because I was no longer there to remind him to return them. Jason prided himself on control, but without me managing the invisible workload of his life, he was unraveling in slow motion. One evening he walked in late, tension visible in the rigid line of his shoulders. He tossed his briefcase onto the couch and ran a hand through his hair. "Missed an important meeting today," he muttered, loosening his tie. I barely looked up from my book. His jaw tightened. "You could have reminded me." I turned a page. "I could have." Silence stretched between us. For the first time in our marriage he didn't hold all the power in the room. The man who had laughed at me in front of his friends now stood before me, uncertain, unsettled, unmoored. And I had never felt more in control. The changes weren't just within the house. I had started stepping into a world that had once felt distant. One where I wasn't just a wife but a person with her own ambitions. My days were no longer spent ensuring Jason's comfort. Instead, I had lunch with old colleagues, reconnected with people who had once respected me for my skills, not my role as someone's spouse. A week passed. The shift was undeniable. Jason noticed, though he didn't fully understand what was happening. He saw the way I dressed differently, the way I carried myself with quiet confidence, the way my attention was no longer tethered to him. One evening as I walked through the door later than usual, he was waiting. Arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Where have you been?" I set down my bag. "Out." "With who?" I met his gaze, unflinching. "Does it matter?" His lips parted but no words came. He wasn't used to this version of me. The woman who had once molded herself around his needs no longer existed. Jason. He was beginning to realize just how much he had relied on someone he had dismissed as insignificant. But he still thought he could fix it. He believed I was going through a phase, that if he ignored it long enough I would return to the version of myself that made his life easier. He was wrong. The night Jason humiliated me in front of his friends, he thought he had made a harmless joke. What he had actually done was set off a chain reaction that he couldn't stop. And soon he would learn just how much I had truly changed. Jason's confusion turned into frustration. He had expected me to snap out of it, to fall back into routine, to be the person who made his life seamless again. But that version of me no longer existed. I wasn't arguing. I wasn't pleading. I wasn't even angry. And that terrified him more than anything. I had become an enigma in my own home, present yet untouchable. My absence wasn't physical, but it was felt in every crack of his unraveling world. No longer the woman waiting at the door with a warm meal, no longer the invisible force managing his schedule, ensuring he never missed a call, a deadline, a responsibility. He started coming home earlier, watching me as if trying to decode an unfamiliar language. His gaze lingered longer, eyes scanning for signs of the woman who used to cater to him. But she was gone. One evening he attempted conversation over dinner, a meal he had ordered because I no longer cooked. The silence between us was thick. He tapped his fingers against the wooden table, a nervous rhythm that betrayed his growing unease. "You've been different lately," he finally muttered, watching me. I took a slow sip of water, meeting his gaze with unshaken calm. "Have I?" His brow furrowed. You do things anymore. I set my glass down carefully. What things? A flicker of frustration crossed his face. You know what I mean. I let his words hang between us, neither confirming nor denying. He needed me to react, to show some form of emotion, to fight. But I had no interest in playing his game anymore. Days turned into weeks and his structured life spiraled further. Meetings were missed, his routine collapsed, small annoyances turned into significant setbacks. I watched as the consequences of my absence stacked up around him. He wasn't handling it well. One evening, after a particularly stressful day at work, he walked in, tossing his keys onto the counter with more force than necessary. His shoulders were tense, his jaw locked. I got chewed out today, he said, expecting sympathy. I raised a brow but said nothing. Jason exhaled sharply. You didn't remind me about the report. I blinked. The report. The one I had to submit today. I tilted my head slightly. Did you need reminding? His nostrils flared. You always remind me. I leaned back against my chair, arms crossing loosely. Not anymore. A muscle in his jaw twitched. This was the moment he finally grasped what had changed. I wasn't just pulling away. I had removed myself completely from the role he had cast me in. But Jason wasn't one to admit fault. Not yet. Instead, he tested the waters, trying to gauge how deep this shift ran. He attempted small gestures. A compliment here, a forced joke there. But none of it reached me. He wasn't used to being ignored, to not having control. One night, as I prepared for bed, he lingered in the doorway. Are we okay? He asked, his voice softer than usual. I met his gaze in the dim light. Are we? He hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. But what could he say? That he missed the wife he had disregarded? That he longed for the woman he had mocked in front of his friends? That he needed me, not for love but because without me his life was falling apart? Instead, he nodded once and walked away. I lay awake that night, listening to the sound of his breathing. He was restless, unsettled, and for the first time he was experiencing what it meant to be the one left in uncertainty. Jason wasn't just losing me, he was losing the power he had taken for granted. He didn't realize it yet, but the war had already been won. Because I no longer cared if he lost. Jason tossed and turned, unable to find comfort in the silence that used to be his refuge. Every exhale, every shift in the bed, every moment of stillness carried a weight he had never noticed before. He was restless, but not for the reasons he once assumed. The house felt different now, empty in a way that had nothing to do with space. It wasn't the absence of sound nor the lack of warmth. It was something deeper. A void he couldn't name. I lay beside him, unmoving, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Sleep was distant, yet I felt no exhaustion. Awareness coursed through me, sharpening every sense. The rise and fall of his breath, the faint creak of the mattress, the tension radiating from his body. All of it told me what he would never say. He was unraveling. The next morning he woke with dark circles beneath his eyes. He dragged himself out of bed, movements sluggish as if weighed down by something unseen. His usual routine, shower, shave, coffee, work, had lost its rhythm. He moved through the motions but with hesitation, as though questioning each step. I watched him from across the room, silent. He caught my gaze in the mirror, pausing mid-button on his shirt. A flicker of something passed through his expression, hesitation perhaps, or uncertainty. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it. Glad he left. I waited until the front door closed before exhaling, a slow release of air I hadn't realized I was holding. The air in the house was lighter without him, the walls breathing easier in his absence. Days blurred into one another, each one chipping away at the carefully crafted illusion of control he had maintained for years. The calls he once ignored now demanded attention. Deadlines loomed unchecked. His social circle, the same men who had once laughed at my expense, had grown distant. Without the seamless structure I had provided, his world had begun to shift in ways he never anticipated. One evening, I returned home later than usual, the scent of unfamiliar cologne clinging to my clothes. Jason was waiting, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. His gaze swept over me, analyzing, searching. Where were you? His voice carried an edge, sharp but not yet cutting. I placed my bag down with measured ease. Out. His jaw tightened. Out where? I met his stare, unblinking. Does it matter? A muscle twitched in his cheek. It does to me. I let the words linger, absorbing the weight of his admission. He was grasping at control, at the remnants of a dynamic that no longer existed. I shrugged. That's new. His expression flickered. Shock, frustration, something else he didn't want to name. He pushed off the counter, closing the space between us. Why are you doing this? I tilted my head slightly, pretending to consider the question. Doing what? His exhale was sharp. This, whatever it is. You're distant. You don't care. You act like I don't exist. I let out a small laugh, not out of amusement, but because the irony was almost poetic. I learned from the best. His eyes darkened, realization creeping in. He had spent years dismissing me, overlooking my presence until I became nothing more than a fixture in his life. And now, for the first time, he was on the receiving end of that indifference. He took a step closer. Is there someone else? The accusation hung between us, a desperate grasp for an explanation that would make sense to him. The idea that I had simply chosen to detach on my own terms was something he couldn't comprehend. I held his gaze, letting the moment stretch until his certainty wavered. Would it change anything if there was? His breath hitched just slightly, but enough for me to catch it. He wasn't used to this feeling. Insecurity had never been his burden to bear. I picked up my bag again, brushing past him without another word. I felt his eyes on me as I walked away, the weight of his thoughts pressing against my back. That night he didn't sleep. I heard him pacing, the floorboards creaking under the rhythm of his thoughts. The cracks in his perfect world had become impossible to ignore. And soon they would shatter completely. The clock on the bedside table glowed in the darkness, each second dragging longer than the last. Jason lay beside me, rigid, his breathing uneven. The weight of the silence between us had grown unbearable, pressing into every corner of the room. He had always been so sure of himself, so convinced that nothing in his world could shift without his command. But the balance had tipped, and he was scrambling to reclaim the control slipping through his fingers. Long after I had turned away, feigning sleep, I heard him exhale sharply. A restless movement followed, sheets rustling as he turned onto his back. The man who had once slept soundly without a care was now wide awake, trapped in the uncertainty of his own making. By morning he was already up, pacing near the dresser. I felt the hesitation in his movements, the unspoken conflict hanging between us. He was waiting, for me to acknowledge him, to bridge the distance he had once forced upon me. But I had no intention of making this easier for him. When I finally stretched, sitting up with slow precision, his eyes darted toward me, searching for something. An opening, perhaps. A moment of weakness. He found none. Do you have plans today? His voice was casual, but the tension behind it was unmistakable. I reached for my robe, slipping it over my shoulders before standing. I do. A flicker of something passed through his expression. Uncertainty. Frustration. Maybe even regret. With who? He pressed, the strain in his voice barely masked. I smoothed the fabric over my arms, taking my time. Does it matter? Jason's jaw clenched. He had asked this before, and my answer remained unchanged. What had once been his favorite game, keeping me on edge, making me second-guess myself, had turned against him. Now he was the one seeking answers, the one left grasping for control. I'll see you later, I said simply, stepping past him without another glance. The house felt lighter the moment I walked out the door. My world had expanded beyond the walls that once confined me, and with each passing day, I found myself rediscovering the parts of me that had been buried beneath years of neglect. I met with old acquaintances, rekindled conversations that had once been a source of joy. Opportunities arose, ones I never would have pursued before. There was an entire existence waiting for me beyond the role I had been assigned, and I was finally embracing it. Jason, however, was unraveling. His attempts to reclaim the dynamic we once had grew desperate. He started coming home earlier, offering small gestures, things that might have once softened me. A compliment here. An unexpected coffee there. But it was too late for all that. He wasn't doing these things because he cared. He was doing them because he was afraid. The realization struck him one evening when he walked through the door and found me laughing. Not the polite, restrained chuckle he had grown accustomed to, but a genuine, uninhibited laugh. The kind that came from deep within. The kind he hadn't heard in years. I was on the phone, engaged in a conversation that had nothing to do with him. When I looked up and saw him standing there, frozen in the doorway, something in his expression shifted. He had always believed I belonged to him, that I existed in relation to his presence. But at that moment he saw the truth. I was no longer his to define. He took a step forward, then hesitated. Who was that? I ended the call, setting my phone down with deliberate ease. An old friend. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Since when do you have old friends? A slow smile tugged at my lips. Since always. Jason exhaled harshly, dragging a hand through his hair. We need to talk. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. About what? His frustration cracked through his carefully controlled facade. About us. About whatever this is. You've changed and I... He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. I don't know what's happening anymore. For the first time, Jason wasn't the one in control. He was standing in the ruins of a life he had built on the assumption that I would always be there to catch him. But I had stepped aside. And now he was falling. You don't know what's happening? I repeated, tilting my head. Then let me explain it to you. His gaze locked onto mine, a silent plea hidden behind the frustration. You spent years treating me like an afterthought, I continued, my voice steady. You laughed at my expense. You dismissed me. And you assumed I would always stay no matter how little you gave in return. He flinched, but I didn't stop. But here's the thing, Jason, I said, pushing off the counter and closing the space between us. I woke up. I realized I don't need to be someone's shadow. I don't need to beg for respect. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. I never meant to. You never meant for me to notice, I interrupted, my voice sharp. But I did. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. His lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, Jason was speechless. He had spent years under the impression that he held all the power, that I would always be there, waiting. But reality had shifted, and he was standing in unfamiliar territory, unsteady and unsure. I grabbed my purse, turning toward the door. I'll be back late. His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. Wait. I looked down at his fingers wrapped around my arm. Slowly, deliberately, I pried them away. Goodbye, Jason. And with that, I walked out, leaving him standing alone in a house that no longer felt like home. The cold night air wrapped around me as I stepped onto the quiet street, leaving behind the suffocating weight of Jason's presence. My heels clicked against the pavement, each step taking me further from the life I had once clung to. The realization of my own freedom settled deep within me, an unfamiliar but exhilarating sensation. I didn't check my phone. I didn't turn back. I knew what I'd see if I did. Jason standing frozen in the doorway, still trying to piece together how everything had changed so drastically. But understanding wouldn't come easily for him. Not yet. The city lights flickered ahead, casting a soft glow over the sidewalks. I walked without direction, simply letting the movement soothe me. The world had always been this vast, this full of possibilities. Yet I had spent years believing my existence was confined to the four walls of a house that never truly felt like mine. Tonight, that illusion was gone. By the time I reached the restaurant, I was no longer the woman Jason had dismissed for so long. I was someone entirely new, someone who no longer needed permission to take up space. Inside, laughter and conversation filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence that had once suffocated me. I spotted familiar faces, people I had once known before I had disappeared into the role of being his wife. They welcomed me back without hesitation, as if no time had passed. As the evening unfolded, I felt lighter than I had in years. I engaged in conversations that had nothing to do with schedules, responsibilities, or expectations. I laughed without restraint. I existed without obligation. Meanwhile, Jason was alone. Hours later, when I finally returned, the house was dark except for a single light in the living room. He was waiting, shoulders tense, gaze locked onto the floor, as if the answers to his unspoken questions lay somewhere in the patterns of the carpet. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, his head lifted and our eyes met. You didn't answer my calls, he said, voice low, measured. I slipped off my coat, unbothered. I know. His brows drew together. Where were you? I crossed the room, setting my purse down without urgency. Out. The simplicity of my response made his frustration spike. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. I deserve an answer. A humorless chuckle escaped me. Do you? Jason exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. He was unraveling in real time, trying to grasp at a reality he had never considered possible. He had spent so long believing I would always be there, that I would always prioritize him, that the idea of me existing beyond him was something he couldn't process. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, voice raw with an emotion I had never heard from him before. I studied him for a moment, taking in the weight of his confession. It was the first time he had acknowledged that something was broken. But the problem was, I no longer needed him to fix anything. "You can't," I said simply. The words landed heavily between us. His breathing faltered, his entire posture shifting as if the ground beneath him had crumbled. Jason had always operated under the assumption that no matter how much distance he put between us emotionally, I would always be waiting on the other side, willing to close the gap. But now there was nothing left to bridge. He moved closer as if proximity could undo the damage. "I know I hurt you," he admitted, the weight of the truth pressing against his words. "I was careless. I took you for granted. I didn't deny it." His hands raked through his hair, frustration evident. I thought you'd always be here." That was the problem. He had never truly seen me, only the version of me that existed to make his life easier. But now, as he stood before me, vulnerable in a way he had never allowed himself to be, it was clear that he finally understood. But it was too late. I reached for my bag again, my decision already made. "I'm leaving." His breath hitched. "Leaving?" I nodded. "For good." Panic flashed across his features, raw and unfiltered. "We can fix this." I shook my head. "No, Jason. You want to fix this because you don't like what it feels like to lose. But that's not love. That's fear." Silence stretched between us, heavier than any argument we had ever had. He swallowed hard. "What if I change?" A soft, sad smile tugged at my lips. "Then do it for yourself." He searched my face for something, hesitation, doubt, anything that would suggest he had a chance. But there was nothing left for him to hold on to. I turned toward the door, my heart steady, my resolve unshaken. And this time when I walked away, I knew I was never coming back. I stepped out of that house without looking back. The night air pressed against my skin, crisp and fresh, as if the universe itself had exhaled with me. My footsteps were steady, firm, carrying me toward a future that no longer held the weight of my past. The door behind me remained closed, and for once I didn't wonder if it would ever open again. Jason had always assumed I was tethered to him, as though I had no existence beyond the role he had carved for me. But with every breath I took, the truth settled deeper within me. I had never belonged to him. I had simply forgotten my own worth. Now, with the weight of his expectations gone, I felt something unfamiliar take its place. Relief. The city buzzed around me, alive and untamed, mirroring the energy humming beneath my skin. I wasn't lost. I wasn't afraid. I was free. As I walked toward the cab waiting at the end of the street, my phone vibrated. I didn't need to check. I already knew who it was. Jason, unable to let go, trying to reach through the distance he had never expected to exist between us. I let it ring. Inside the car, I exhaled, staring out at the world stretching ahead. For the first time in years, my future wasn't shaped by his needs or desires. It was mine. Unwritten. Boundless. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "Where to?" I smiled, savoring the power of my own decision. "Anywhere but here." The vehicle pulled away, taking me further from the life I had outgrown. Somewhere behind me, in that quiet, darkened house, Jason was alone. He had thought I would always be there, waiting. He had believed my love was unconditional, that my loyalty was unbreakable. He had been wrong. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Without the invisible chains of obligation, I rediscovered parts of myself I had long abandoned. Mornings weren't dictated by his schedule. Nights weren't spent waiting for his return. Every choice belonged to me. I found a small apartment, nothing extravagant, but it was mine. A space untouched by the past, filled only with things I loved. Colors I chose. Books that lined my shelves, not because they impressed guests, but because they spoke to my soul. My days were filled with purpose beyond service. I enrolled in classes, reignited passions I had once shelved. Opportunities blossomed in the places I had forgotten to look. Independence wasn't just an idea. It became my reality. "Jason?" He called. He texted. Each message carried a desperation he had never shown before. Apologies arrived in long-winded paragraphs, filled with words he had never spoken when it mattered. Promises dripped from his lips like honey, but they no longer held any sweetness. I read them but never responded. One evening as I sipped coffee at a small cafe, a familiar presence entered. He looked different, less sure, more hesitant. He spotted me and exhaled as if relieved to have found me. He approached with careful steps, uncertainty woven into every movement. "Can we talk?" I set my cup down, meeting his gaze with unwavering calm. "About what?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Us." A soft laugh escaped me, not cruel but amused by the irony. "There is no us, Jason." His jaw tightened. "I messed up. I see that now." I tilted my head, studying him. "Do you? Or do you just miss the way I made your life easier?" He hesitated, and in that moment I had my answer. Jason wasn't here because he loved me. He was here because he had lost something irreplaceable. His safety net, his constant. He had never expected me to walk away, never imagined a reality where I no longer needed him. But that was his burden to bear, not mine. I picked up my cup again, taking a slow sip before standing. "I wish you well, Jason." His brows furrowed. "That's it." I smiled, a genuine one this time. "That's all that's left." And with that I left him sitting there watching as I walked away. The past no longer had a hold on me. My future was mine to create. And I had never felt more alive.